This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. If you like us, and we hope you like us, please join our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find all about it on our homepage. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shenlin. Every week we talk about books and research and things that we think are cool. Our guest today is Dr. Hagai Boas. He heads the Science, Technology, and Civilization program at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. His research focuses on medical sociology. He's published articles on vaccinations and social solidarity, brain death and religiosity, fun stuff. Popular science and bioethics, and his book, The Plural Me, The Political Economy of Organ Transplantations in Hebrew, is forthcoming. From 2001 to 2013, he was the chief editor of the science radio program, The University on Air. He has served as the director of academic programs of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Tel Aviv University. And Dr. Boas is the lead editor of a book called Bioethics and Biopolitics in Israel, which is a collection of essays and research articles on the social, legal, and political aspects of bioethics in Israel, which is what we will be discussing today. Hagai, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Gilad and Dahlia. I would like to add that the book was edited also by Yael Shiloni Dolev, Nadav Davidovich, Danny Filk, and Shai Lavi. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for mentioning that. Those are illustrious people indeed. Tell us, what is bioethics and the Jewish problem? Is this a particular form? The elephant in the Jewish problem.
Yeah, the bioethics
what is bioethics
and the Jewish problem?
Maybe tell us about bioethics a little more generally, and then explain why there is bioethics in the Jewish problem.
Well, let's first discuss what is bioethics. And bioethics is something new, actually. It was introduced into our reality after the World War II, mainly by the impact of the war and the lesson learned from that war about the role that medics played in that war. Many remember the Nuremberg trials, the event where the Nazis were tried by the Americans and where some killed themselves, some were executed. But few know that besides the Nuremberg trials on war crimes, there were another trial, the doctors' trial, the Nazi doctors. This was the only profession that was tried after the war. And the world was shocked that the German doctors, which were considered like the high of the profession before the war, the apex of Western civilization, German medicine was considered to be the most advanced, the most perhaps rational, enlightened, and the German doctors were the ones that were participated in the horrors of the World War II more than any other profession.
Would you say that up until that moment, medicine was perceived as an inherent force for good, and then, suddenly it ceased to be that, and that opened up all sorts of philosophical and ethical questions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's say that the dark side of medicine was introduced during that war. And perhaps bioethics is a reaction to that. And to try to phrase medical codes that will, let's say, limit the power of doctors over patients.
Which is interesting in a way, because probably this perception of medicine being an infallible profession arose out of the Enlightenment itself, in the sense that science is the answer to all things and the true truth. And now people realize there's a side of human evil that has sort of arisen or continues to threaten even those wonderful Enlightenment values.
Yes, so without entering this fascinating topic, what is the impact of the Holocaust on the critical theory versus the Enlightenment movement? most celebrated book in this context is The Dialectics of Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer. So without entering that very intricate topic, it would suffice to say that this, let's say, realization went over the medical profession itself. And what is called in our book liberal bioethics was emerging from that reaction.
Explain this to us. Why is it a liberal concept?
Okay, it's a liberal concept because, first of all, it emerged within the cultural context of Western liberalism. And it is reflecting most clearly the values of liberal thinking. For instance, the emphasis on individuality, the emphasis on autonomy, on consent, all of these pillars of bioethics, of what we understand as the basic relationship between the doctors and their patients, actually were framed in the context of liberalism. And they overlap many liberal practices. So we understand that as liberal bioethics. Liberal bioethics, which is a construct of analytic philosophy and legal thinking, they are the two, let's say, theoretical background of bioethics, construct or produced liberal bioethics mainly as a medical ethics, as something which bind the doctors from doing that or doing this, and tell them how to conduct in the bedside manners, so to speak, to sign or to ask for consent from patients before medical procedures, to have these committees before that will protect subjects in medical experiments and so on and so forth.
But wait, so then how is medical ethics different from bioethics? Mm-hmm. Is it a subset?
Okay, so in many places and in many instances, they are overlapping, they are synonyms. When you speak about bioethics, you speak mainly about medical ethics. And this was the starting point of our project. We wanted to discern bioethics from medical ethics and to understand bioethics as a different topic from medical ethics. Although medical ethics have these strong and very important values, we wanted to tell another story.
I know what you're going to ask.
Do you see, I'm not so sure, do you see bioethics as embedded in the emergence of human rights more broadly? I mean, especially precisely the fact that the liberal paradigm stopped, addressing all these issues in a comprehensive manner, and the flaws of the liberal paradigm had to be addressed in some way.
I think I was almost right, because ultimately we're asking what is the political context here, and then that opens up this question of biopolitics.
So yes, I agree that bioethics was part of this major movement, the post-war movement that tried to understand what is universal rights and what is human rights and what is common to all of us as humans that cannot be transgressed, or what are crimes against humanity, terms that were not existed before the war. And that was precisely our project as well, in general context and in the context of Israel that I will
we'll get to that
refer.
In a minute.
But the idea is to tell the story of bioethics from an historical and political and social aspect, which is often ignored bioethics that focus only on the central problem, the ethical problem at hand.
Probably the most groundbreaking innovation in biopolitics and bioethics was Foucault. His study on biopolitics. I think he even coined the term, right? Exactly in the sense that we were talking about now, that it stopped being some sort of societal issue, and he conceptualized it as a way that society polices and disciplines the individual.
Or disciplines and punish. Ha, ha,
Oh,
ha.
ha, ha, ha. How does your project, I mean, you draw on Foucault quite copiously and, of course, follow in his footsteps to a great degree, but I'm trying to understand what, other than the case of Israel, what conceptual additions did you expect introducing to Foucault's analysis?
I think that our main finding was that although bioethics introduces itself as neutral, we discovered its biopolitical aspects, which is often disguised or not introduced it at the open. I think that the most telling case that we were studying was the force feeding, where we actually, in the study of Dr. Yoav Kenny, who conducted this study and wrote the chapter on it in our book, he actually understands bioethics and biopolitics as the same practice. I think that the Foucauldian concept on biopolitics was referring to different kinds of governmentality and to different practices of discipline and subject. And I think that in bioethics we see that clearly because we have this very face value aspect of neutrality, of objectivity. Like medical ethics refers to the proper relations between doctors and patients everywhere. You have to sign subject on consent form, the same consent form everywhere. This is like the most objective and liberal and liberating practices everywhere. But when we are closing or zooming in our overlook on what is happening actually, we see that history and sociology comes in. And the facet of an anonymous individual that is allegedly the subject of bioethics becomes a person. We start our book by setting like an imaginative scene where we located in Israel. The two persons, the two women that sit there have different approach to the practice. One to use sperm from a dead person, which is a practice which is legal only in Israel. The other is waiting for a 4th or 5th cycle of IVF, which is also
I think you say 10th in the book.
And 10th
Yes.
in the book, which is also very unique to Israel. So only in that scene, in that first paragraph, we see how bioethics becomes biopolitics.
I think this is a very interesting example because you say it's imaginary, but it's not actually imaginary. These cases have taken place. And I think I understand now when you say that bioethics is part of a much larger vision of understanding the fuller context of biopolitics. Now we can see why there is a uniquely Israeli manifestation of this, as there would be a unique political manifestation of bioethics in any other country, because every country has politics. So now we can, in a way, you've answered my first question, which was about Jewish bioethics, but really it's about the Israeli manifestation. So tell us more about some of the examples that you've raised. I mean, you talked about the force feeding. Why is that such an Israeli political medical situation?
Yes, well, the force
feeding of Palestinian prisoners.
Yeah, the force feeding of Palestinian prisoner was introduced once as a medical issue, whether or not they will die or not, and what is the obligation of medical practitioners here, whether they are obliged to feed them.
I think we should just clarify that these are hunger strikers.
Yes.
That's why they need to be force-fed.
Yeah, they are hunger strikers, and they are political hunger strikers.
That in itself was a subject of debate.
Yeah. So first scene is the medical scene, is the allegedly liberal bioethical thing that every prisoner is an individual and need of medical aid because he's a hunger striker. But as we know, and the story tells, this is not solely a medical issue, but is also a political issue. Force feeding is part of the political situation. So the two are conflated. You cannot actually distinguish the two, one from another. Although bioethicists and medical ethicists always try to answer the medical question in it. But we see as sociologists and historians and political scientists that actually this kind of separation is very artificial, and the boundaries between bioethics and biopolitics are very blurred.
So to what extent do you see really the existence of an open-ended violent conflict as the breeding ground of all issues of bioethics and biopolitics in Israel? To what extent is it really the defining character of Israeli bioethics?
Well, I think that is the real question here, that is still to be open in our book, although our...
What, you left an open question?
Yes,
That's why I'm asking it.
Yes,
oh, that's
we did.
the great thing about books. They open up questions.
There is a discourse about Israeli exceptionalism, about whether or not the factors like the demographic threat, the Holocaust, influence the special character of Israeli reproduction practices.
And of course, the role of Jewish religion.
And the role of
Israeli
Jewish
politics.
religion and so on and so forth. It says, actually, Israel has a kind of unique practices where in relation to reproduction, it is very liberal, but in relation to end-of-life practices, it is very conservative comparative to other countries. So this unique characteristic needs an explanation. And it's very easy to ascribe explanations, big explanation, like pronatality, demographics, Jewish tradition, Jewish law, the Holocaust, and so on and so forth. But we want to dig further to see what exactly is distinguished between Israel and, let's say, other familial, that is, countries or societies where the family is very central, cultures. We want to dig in further. But I wanted just to add another aspect to our last discussion about the bioethic, biopolitics interrelationship, and say that there is a big irony in the fact that actually we see that distinction between bioethics and biopolitics is kind of an artificial one. Because if we return into our point of departure in this our conversation, we said that bioethics was emerging from the horrors of the World War II. Is a post-war reaction. That is, it wishes to discern itself from biopolitics, to establish like a free and neutral zone of medical ethics. And what we see in our cases that it was failing to do that. It failed to do that. And our examples and case studies all over the books introduce different cases where bioethics fails to be this liberal, free, liberating ideology and actually is embedded in a very concrete social context.
Well, I mean, there's so many issues we've raised, but I think we do want to pick up on exactly what you pointed out. This contradiction that in some ways, in some of the specific medical issues, Israel has a more liberal approach, for example, on things like abortion, stem cell research, IVF, universal health care, of course. And then on the other hand, there are other areas where Israel is more conservative. Can you talk about a few of these cases? Like, why is Israel, Dafka, more liberal on things like abortion? And what is the corresponding areas where Israel is particularly conservative?
Yes, so there is, among the researchers of this subject, there is this very famous contradiction between liberal beginning-of-life practices and very restrictive and conservative attitudes toward end of life.
So we like when people are born, we don't like when people die.
Yeah, something like that. So I think that the answer lies in our conceptualization of life. what is life.
And you say our. Who is the our?
The our is Israeli. Okay.
Israeli Jewish?
Yes, Israeli Jewish, because this is the dominating ideology in the state, not because other reasons, not because of reason of values or something like that. This is purely political and cultural discussion about what is the political forces that actually write the law, practice the law. So, yes, this is about the conceptualization of life. Once life is detected, in the beginning of life, we say that it is like after the 8th or 9th week. And once it is detected, it is sacred. Okay? So if life is sacred only after the 8th or 9th week of the pregnancy, so there is a license to manipulate, to exercise different practices on what is not life before the 8th week. So this could be one explanation. This explanation also refers to the end of life. If the person is still alive, so no resuscitation is needed. Or, of course, no brain death declaration is legal or something like that. So the actual point where life is detected and end of life is detected also, like in brain dead bodies, I think that this could be one explanation, but it is not the only explanation, and still more research is needed.
Right. I mean, I think it's still interesting that this doesn't seem entirely unique. I mean, of course, America is a great example where you have religious, political values fused into medical ethics. So, huge debates over similar medical issues. So is this really unique to Israel, the fact that there is this dilemma between a liberal approach and a conservative/religious influenced approach towards medicine?
No, it is practiced in different ways. In the U.S., abortion could, bring presidents down. In Israel, abortions are not such a highly political issue. But the energy put in biomedical laws in Israel is great. There is much effort in that area, mainly in the religious, secular concept.
To what extent do you see the fundamental tenets of bioethics as they emerged in the wake of World War II? To what extent are they still relevant today with great technological advancement? I mean, we're talking about issues that were unfathomable back then. I mean, organ donation and IVF and all sorts of things that really define the way society treats, the very essence of biopolitics. To what extent do you see that as a continuum, as some sort of graduation?
Well, my expertise is organ donation, the political economy of organ donation, and the anthropology of organ donation. And organ transplants were emerged hand in hand with bioethics. They were emerged in the 60s, where the Helsinki Declaration was introduced, and their development much represent the development in technology at one hand, and the concept of humanity. In organ donation, there is something transgressive of the human body. The actual very basic concept of body, self, otherness, my selfhood and the otherness, and what does it mean to have a body with an extra organ or without an organ, the dead and the living, all of these, let's say, very big issues are condensated in the issue of organ donation. You have post-mortem organ donation and living organ donation, and each of these practice bears another cultural significance. So technological development brings with itself more ethical dilemmas.
But the issues remain the same at the end of the day?
But the issues of the formal liberal bioethics of organ donation remain the same. They are about motivation, they are about consent, they are about fairly and justified and very transparent allocation of organs.
Interesting, because it's exactly the opposite of how the first heart transplant happened in Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yes, not just in Israel. The first transplants were contradicted to all that bioethical's bagage, let's say.
You tell this story wonderfully in the book. Can you tell us?
Yes, it's the story of Moshe Sadgat, who was the first donor, let's say, if the word donor is appropriate here, the first person that his heart was taken for a heart transplant. It is important perhaps to mention that the Israeli legal system, as in similar way to other places in the world, did not require the consent of the family for organ retrieval. The idea was that the corpse is a dead matter that can be used for medical purposes, especially for the saving of life. So they just took the heart. It was in 1968 in the Bellinson Hospital. They just took the heart. Indeed, and this raised a very highly and stormy debate in Israel. Why did they take the heart, first of all, without telling the family?
And you claim the family didn't even know.
Yeah, and the family asked for an investigation of the hospital, and the hospital refused. And it was only after the involvement of the health minister and some public debate about that the hospital had to admit that the heart was taken to transplant. And this was one result of this Sadgat case in 1968. Another result was that the whole issue of organ donation, of post-mortem organ donation, raised to the public awareness, and the question popped, what is the Israeli unique, the Jewish approach towards this new practice? And since then, until now actually, the religious approach towards organ donation is not something which is clearly known. There is the, let's say, the broad mainstream current of Orthodox Jewish thought that accept brain death and, let's be accurate, they accept respiratory brain death, which is only the part of the brain that is in charge of breathing. Once this function no longer exists, the person is dead. So this is the current of that accept brain death. And there is this always opposing circles of ultra-Orthodox Jews that it seems that no matter what, they will always oppose brain death and therefore organ donation.
To what extent these theological back and forth, to what extent does it influence policy?
Well, they influence...
Well, considering they have the health ministry.
Yeah,
yes.
Well, now they do. But is it just because of that? Or?
No. They always did. The transplantation law of 2008 was discussed for years in the Knesset because of these tensions between the religious aspects of brain death and, let's say, the medical approach of expanding organ donations to the extent that Israel will be one of the, let's say, average Western world. Israel is in a very awkward position here because Israel has the universal coverage for undergoing transplants for patients that need transplants. They have the most advanced technical stuff. They have the operation room already existed. What they don't have is organs. So
because not enough people are
because not
donors.
enough people, secular and Orthodox alike, has a consent actually to organ donations.
Well, this is what I think is really interesting, is because you're saying the contradiction comes from within the religious attitude, but that it's a problem, lack of organ donation, also among seculars.
Yes.
Why is that?
So in my chapter that I wrote together with Shai Lavi on organ donation, brain death, and the limits of liberal bioethics, we argue that actually the problem is much more deeper than just politics of status quo, of the religious and secular debates. Although the problem appears to us as a religious and secular, it actually introduces the very problem of organ donation in liberal bioethics in itself. It says that liberal bioethics, with its usage of consent and altruism as its and transparency as its most, let's say, common tools, it fails to actually discern between two problems, which are brain death and organ donation. And actually what we see here is the politicization of organ donation and brain death from being scientific problems once they are concerned what is death and what is not death, and from being ethical issues, how to distribute organs, and becomes political issues of who shall be the one that will donate more. And we see that all over the period of the transplantation practices here in Israel. From 1968 till now, we debate who is the group that donate less. So funny or bizarre for the researcher, but very tragic to the persons involved.
Well, I think this certainly highlights that the issue of bioethics and biopolitics in Israel is not only about the conflict and the demographic issues, but that it reflects a whole range of social constructs in Israel, the religious identity, Jewish identity, cultural, the influence of that identity on general culture in Israel, and the politics of the conflict. And basically, your book is about everything.
Yeah, all of which are covered in the 15 chapters of this book.
You can learn about suicide and force feeding and securitization and lots more. Everybody should read the book.
Yeah.
But on that note.
Yeah, this is all we have time for. Dr. Hagai Boas, the head of Science, Technology and Civilization at the Van Leer Institute and the co-editor of the book Bioethics and Biopolitics in Israel, Socio-Legal, Political and Empirical Analysis, just came out by Cambridge University Press. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And together with your many colleagues, we should say, because those are all very important researchers as well. Thanks also to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. And a request. Many of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review, and then write one. You can also support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing to our Patreon campaign. We have gifts and perks and cool things. Check out our archive. We have almost 500 interviews. And please like us on Facebook as well. That's a lot, but it's really not that hard. Just click like. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.